In the autumn of 1887, a 34-year-old widow named Clara Bowen packed 1,847 pounds of food into a root cellar she had dug herself with a borrowed iron spade and a mule that had already gone lame. Her nearest neighbor was 23 miles east across the Bighorn Basin in Wyoming Territory. She had 3 children, the youngest was 4, the oldest was 11. And the winter that followed was the worst the northern plains had seen in 61 years. By March, cattle ranchers across the territory had lost 63% of their herds. Entire homesteads went dark. The Casper Weekly Register would later report that 14 families in Johnson County alone abandoned their claims and walked away from everything they had built. Clara Bowen did not walk away. When the snow finally broke in April of 1888, she had 31 pounds of food left, not because she miscalculated, because she had fed 2 neighboring families through February and March after their stores ran out. She had arrived with 1,847 pounds. She had preserved and processed every pound of it herself using 11 techniques that have almost completely vanished from modern knowledge. When her granddaughter donated Clara's handwritten preservation journal to the Wyoming State Archives in 1961, the archivist who cataloged it wrote in his notes that it was, quote, the most complete single-source record of frontier food preservation methodology we have encountered in 22 years of collection. That journal sat in a filing cabinet for 47 years before anyone wrote about it seriously. What Clara knew, what women like her across the frontier knew, was not folk magic or luck. It was a precise, methodical system built from necessity, passed down through generations, and refined by women who understood that a single mistake in August meant a dead child in January. This is what she knew. The first thing Clara did every single year, beginning in late July, was what she called her count forward, a phrase she used 9 separate times in her journal across different entries. She did not ask how much food she had. She asked how many days she needed to survive. From the first frost to the last frost in the Bighorn Basin in that era, the average isolation window was 187 days. Clara calculated for 210. She added 23 days of buffer every single year, no exceptions, because her mother had told her that the woman who plans for the average winter dies in the hard one. She then multiplied 210 days by the caloric needs of each person in her household, something most people today don't realize frontier women tracked with serious precision. Her journal lists daily targets: adult woman doing heavy labor, 2,800 calories; child age 11 doing moderate labor, 2,100 calories; child age 7, 1,700 calories; child age 4, 1,200 calories. Total daily household requirement, 7,800 calories. Multiply that by 210 days, 1,638,000 calories needed to guarantee survival. Then she worked backward. Every food she preserved, she recorded in caloric density per pound, not exact to modern nutritional science, but startlingly close. She knew that dried venison carried roughly 800 calories per pound, rendered lard 3,500, dried corn 1,600. Her journal entry from August 3, 1885 reads, put up 34 pounds corn today. Figure it as near 54,000 calories against the count. That is not a woman guessing. That is a woman doing mathematics that most modern preppers never bother with. The count-forward method meant she never overpacked perishables and never underpacked staples. It was the foundation everything else was built on. The second technique in Clara's system was what she called the salt ladder, and it is almost certainly the most misunderstood preservation method of the entire frontier era. Most people today think of salt preservation as a simple process. You pack meat in salt and it lasts. That is not what Clara did, and the difference is why her meat lasted 27 to 31 months while most frontier families were lucky to get 8. The salt ladder worked in 3 stages across 19 days. In the first stage, days 1 through 4, meat was packed in a coarse salt mixture at a ratio of 1 pound of salt per 6 pounds of meat. Not 5, not 7. Clara was specific, 1 to 6. The coarse grind pulled surface moisture aggressively. She used a particular salt she sourced from a trader in Buffalo, Wyoming, which had a slightly higher mineral content than refined table salt. She noted it left a faint gray residue on her hands that plain salt did not. In the second stage, days 5 through 11, she removed the meat, wiped it, and repacked it in a finer salt at a ratio of 1 pound of salt per 9 pounds of meat. Less aggressive. The finer grind penetrated deeper tissue without drawing out so much moisture that the meat became brittle. In the third stage, days 12 through 19, she added a mixture of 3 parts salt, 1 part brown sugar, and what she described as a small pour of apple cider vinegar to each layer. This created what food historians now recognize as an equilibrium cure, a technique that was being developed professionally in commercial meatpacking houses in Chicago at roughly the same moment Clara was doing it alone in Wyoming, working entirely from intuition and experience. Her journal notes that meat processed through the full salt ladder could be stored in a cool root cellar for no less than 26 months, and likely longer than a body would ever need to test. She processed 847 pounds of meat this way in the autumn of 1887, mostly venison, some elk, 14 pounds of black bear that she described as strong but serviceable. The third technique was her fat rendering process, and this is where Clara's system separated completely from what most people understand about frontier food preservation. Fat is the most calorie-dense food that can be preserved without refrigeration. Clara knew this instinctively. Her journal dedicates more pages to fat rendering than to any other single topic, 23 pages in total, with diagrams drawn in pencil that are still legible today. She rendered in 3 categories. The first was leaf lard, rendered from the fat surrounding the kidneys and loin of hogs and deer. She filtered this 3 times through cloth so fine it took 4 hours to drain a single batch. The result was a pure white, nearly tasteless fat that she stored in sealed clay crocks. A single crock held 14 pounds of rendered leaf lard and represented 49,000 calories, enough to sustain one adult for 17 days on fat alone. The second was tallow rendered from beef and mutton fat at a higher temperature, between what she described as a shiver and a roll in the pot, which modern cooks would identify as approximately 250 to 275 degrees Fahrenheit. Tallow stores harder than lard and has a longer shelf life. Clara noted in her journal that a batch rendered correctly would show no turn of color or smell at 18 months without any particular care. The third was bone marrow, and this is the one almost nobody talks about. Clara cracked long bones, femurs, tibias, humeri, split them lengthwise with a hand axe, and roasted them cut side up at low heat until the marrow ran liquid. She collected this in a small clay dish, let it cool to a solid, and stored it sealed under a thin layer of rendered tallow. Bone marrow is extraordinarily calorie-dense, approximately 3,400 calories per pound, and contains fat-soluble vitamins that were the difference between a family that got through winter and a family that developed the signs of malnutrition despite having enough to eat. Her total fat stores going into the winter of 1887, 211 pounds across all 3 categories. That single category alone represented 680,000 calories, more than 41% of her entire winter caloric target. The fourth technique was her root vegetable burial system, which she called simply the pit method, and which she had refined across 7 consecutive winters by the time she recorded it in the journal we have today. The common version of root cellaring that most people know involves digging a hole, lining it with straw, packing in vegetables, covering with more straw, and hoping for the best. That is not what Clara did. Clara's pit was dug to a depth of 6 feet, 4 inches, specifically because that depth in the Bighorn Basin soils of that era maintained a temperature of between 34 and 38 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. She had determined this over 3 years of measurement using a mercury thermometer she had purchased in 1881 for $1.35 from a general store in Thermopolis. She recorded temperature readings from that pit in her journal 4 times per year: early spring, midsummer, first frost, and midwinter. The fifth technique was her dried corn processing system, and this is where Clara crossed into something that most frontier accounts completely overlook: the chemistry of food preservation. She did not simply dry corn, she nixtamalized it, a Mesoamerican process she had learned from a Shoshone woman named Mary Teton who had traded at the same post near Buffalo where Clara bought her salt. Clara does not use the word nixtamalization in her journal. She calls it the lime corn method and describes it as something Mary Teton's grandmother had taught her, and that the white settlers all think is unnecessary and all of them are wrong. Nixtamalization involves soaking and cooking dried corn kernels in an alkaline solution, traditionally wood ash lye or calcium hydroxide, which breaks down the outer hull of the kernel and, crucially, releases niacin bound inside the corn in a form the human body cannot absorb in untreated corn. The settlers who skipped this step and lived on plain dried corn for extended periods developed pellagra, a niacin deficiency disease that causes skin lesions, dementia, and death. It was epidemic in the American South for decades and was only definitively linked to corn-dependent diets in 1914. Clara Bowen and Mary Teton knew to process the corn correctly 27 years before American medicine figured out why. Clara processed 94 pounds of dried corn using the lime corn method every autumn. She also dried an additional 38 pounds of plain corn for use in ways that did not require cooking, primarily as animal feed, and as a base for a dried cornmeal she made by grinding processed kernels on a hand stone mill she had built herself from 2 flat sandstone pieces she had hauled 6 miles from a creek bed. The total dried and processed corn she stored for the winter of 1887, 132 pounds. The sixth technique was her preservation of alliums, onions, wild garlic, and what she called the bitter bulbs, which appear from her descriptions to have been wild leeks gathered from creek bottoms in early spring and dried for winter use. She braided her onions in the standard frontier manner, 47 braids total that autumn, averaging 11 onions each, but she added one step that distinguished her stores from every other homestead in her region. Before braiding, she cured each onion for exactly 14 days in a structure she had built specifically for the purpose. The curing structure was a 3-sided shed she called her dry house, open on the south-facing side to allow maximum airflow, constructed from split pine with gaps between the boards on the other 3 sides. She positioned it 14 feet from the main house on the eastern side of her property, which she had determined gave it the optimal combination of afternoon sun and prevailing wind protection for her specific location. The 14-day cure allowed the outer skin of each onion to fully papery, what modern food scientists call suberization, the formation of a cork-like protective layer over the cut stem and any surface damage. An onion properly cured will store for 9 to 12 months in cool, dry conditions. An onion stored without curing rarely makes it past 5. Clara's cured onions from the autumn of 1887 were still in good condition when she served the last of them in mid-March of 1888, 7 months after they had been harvested. The seventh technique was her vinegar preservation system, which she called putting up in sour, and which she used for a category of foods most modern people think of as impossible to preserve without refrigeration: green vegetables, wild herbs, and certain fruits. She made her own apple cider vinegar. This is the first important point. Commercial vinegar available at frontier trading posts was often adulterated or of inconsistent acidity, and Clara had learned, again, from experience rather than formal chemistry, that preservation failures were more often a result of weak acid than of technique errors. She made vinegar by pressing wild crab apples gathered from creek bottom thickets in late August, fermenting the juice in a 12-gallon oak barrel to hard cider over 3 to 4 weeks, then exposing the cider to air and a culture she maintained continuously, what we now call a mother of vinegar, until the alcohol converted to acetic acid. She tested acidity by taste and by a simple observation. Vinegar strong enough to preserve would make her eyes water when she held her face over an open crock. She noted in her journal that weak sour smells only, strong sour bites the air. Into vinegar brine she put 22 pounds of wild green tomatoes harvested just before first frost, 14 pounds of green beans processed whole, 9 pounds of wild mustard greens gathered in late summer and blanched briefly before packing, 6 pounds of wild ramps, and 11 pounds of cucumbers from her kitchen garden that had grown too large to eat fresh. She also preserved 34 pounds of wild plums and chokecherries in a sweetened vinegar solution, 3 parts vinegar, 1 part wild honey, that produced a fruit that kept 14 months and served as the primary source of vitamin C for her family across the winter. The eighth technique was her meat smoking process, which she combined with the salt ladder rather than using as an alternative to it. She smoked meat only after completing the full 19-day salt ladder cure. This sequencing is critical and almost universally reversed in modern amateur preservation. Most people smoke fresh or lightly salted meat, which produces a product with a shelf life of weeks rather than months. She built her smokehouse from green cottonwood logs, specifically green, not dry, because dry cottonwood burns too fast and too hot for cold smoking. The internal dimensions of her smokehouse were 6 feet wide, 8 feet deep, and 7 feet tall at the peak. She maintained a smoke temperature she described as warm on the hand at arm's reach but not hot, which corresponds to approximately 80 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit, well within the cold smoking range that preserves rather than cooks. She used 3 wood types in specific combinations: green apple wood for the base smoke, which she sourced from a small stand of wild crabapple trees 2 miles from her homestead; dried sage bundled and added at intervals for a secondary aromatic that she believed, correctly, also had antimicrobial properties; and occasionally dried juniper berries thrown directly on the coals for the final hour of each smoking session. The smoking duration for fully salt-cured venison, 41 hours over a 3-day period, never running the fire unattended for more than 2 hours. The result was a product with a water activity low enough to inhibit bacterial growth for well over a year at root cellar temperatures, and a flavor that her journal describes, in a rare moment of something like pride, as better than any meat I have tasted that cost money. The ninth technique was her grain storage system, which is perhaps the most practically replicable piece of her entire methodology for modern use. She stored 3 types of grain: wheat berries, rye, and dried field peas that she classified as grain for storage purposes. Her total grain stores for the winter of 1887: 218 pounds of wheat berries, 74 pounds of rye, 61 pounds of dried field peas. The method that made her grain stores exceptional was her oxygen management system, a technique she had developed after losing 44 pounds of wheat to weevil infestation in the winter of 1883, which she recorded as her single worst preservation failure across all 11 years of her homesteading. After losing that grain, she spent the following spring and summer experimenting. Her solution, recorded in detail in the journal, was a 3-step process. First, she spread each batch of grain in thin layers on a clean canvas tarp in direct sun for 3 full days, turning it every 2 hours. This killed surface insect eggs. Second, she packed the dried grain into clay crocks that she had sealed at the interior with a beeswax and pine resin mixture she melted together at a ratio of roughly 3 parts beeswax to 1 part resin. This made the crocks nearly airtight. Third, she dropped a small piece of burning pine fatwood into each crock immediately before sealing the lid, letting it burn out inside the sealed container, a crude but effective oxygen displacement technique that consumed the available oxygen before the lid was pressed into its wax seal. She lost 0 grain to insect damage in any winter following 1883. The 10th technique was her egg preservation method, and it is the one that most consistently surprises people who encounter it for the first time. Clara kept 17 hens. In the peak summer months of June through August, those hens produced an average of 14 eggs per day. In winter, with short days and cold temperatures, egg production dropped to 1 or 2 per day at best, and often to 0. She solved this problem with water glass, a solution of sodium silicate dissolved in water, available at pharmacies and general stores in that era under the name soluble glass, and costing approximately 15 cents per pound in 1887 currency. She filled a large stoneware crock, 4-gallon capacity, with a solution of 1 part water glass to 9 parts boiled and cooled water. Into this solution she carefully submerged fresh, unwashed eggs laid within the previous 24 hours, the unwashed condition being critical, because the natural bloom coating on a fresh egg is what allows the water glass preservation to seal effectively. Eggs stored in water glass solution maintain edible quality for 9 to 12 months with no additional intervention. The whites become slightly thinner with extended storage, and the yolks develop a very mild secondary flavor, but both remain fully nutritious and functional for baking, scrambling, and all other culinary uses. Clara's preserved egg stores for the winter of 1887, 4 full crocks, each holding between 140 and 160 eggs, for a total of approximately 604 eggs entering the winter season. She recorded using the last water glass egg on March 17, 1888. The 11th technique was the most important of all, not because it preserved any single food, but because it was the organizational system that prevented the cumulative failures that destroyed most frontier families' winter stores. Clara called it the rotation sheet. It was a single piece of paper, updated weekly throughout the winter, that tracked every food category, the current quantity in storage, the estimated quantity remaining through winter's end, and a simple 3-symbol notation system she had invented herself. A circle meant the supply was on track, a half circle meant she needed to reduce consumption of that item, and an X meant she needed to substitute immediately and begin rationing. She updated the rotation sheet every Sunday, without exception. Even on the Sunday of January 12, 1888, when she recorded in the journal that the temperature had dropped to 41 degrees below zero, and she had kept the children in the bed with her for 3 days to conserve heat. She updated the sheet that Sunday. She noted the update in her journal with exactly 2 words: sheet current. The rotation sheet meant that Clara never reached the bottom of any single food category without warning. She caught developing shortfalls 6 to 8 weeks before they became critical, enough time to adjust consumption patterns, substitute alternative foods, or, in the worst case, make decisions about who ate what with enough runway to avoid crisis. Most frontier families who starved did not starve because they ran out of food. They starved because they ran out of food they didn't know they were running out of until it was too late to do anything about it. Clara Bowen ran out of nothing. She chose to give 31 pounds of her remaining stores to her neighbors because her rotation sheet told her, with enough confidence to act on, that she had exactly that much to spare. The winter of 1887 to 1888, known historically as the Great Die-Up, killed approximately 1 in 5 cattle in the entire northern plains region. It bankrupted ranchers who had been millionaires the previous spring. It reshaped the economics of the American West permanently. A 34-year-old widow in the Bighorn Basin with 3 children and a lame mule came out of it with food to spare. She did not have better luck than her neighbors. She did not have more money, better land, or stronger livestock. She had 11 techniques, learned, refined, recorded, and executed with a discipline that most modern people, surrounded by grocery stores and refrigeration, will never be required to develop. Her journal is still in the Wyoming State Archives. It has been digitized and is accessible to anyone who asks. Most people never ask. The knowledge is still there. The question is whether anyone cares enough to learn it before they need it. Because if Clara Bowen's winter taught us anything, it is this: the time to learn how to survive a hard winter is not when the snow starts falling. It is in August, when everything is fine, when you still have time, when you can still count forward.